Hi everyone, I'm Brooke with Burnley and Trowbridge, and you're joining us today for our two-part Mantelet sew-along. For this sew-along, we will be using our Burnley and Trowbridge Mantelet pattern, which can be purchased as a digital download or as a hybrid pattern on our website. Just check for the links in the description below. Before we begin though, let's hear a bit from Angela Burnley about mantelets in the 18th century.
Hi everyone. As Brooke said, I'm going to give you a little bit of history about mantelets. Mantelets are a cloak-like garment that entered the feminine wardrobe in the second quarter of the 18th century. They were perceived as a casual or undress garment and were initially worn indoors in informal settings. By the third quarter of the 18th century, they had established themselves as a public-facing part of the wardrobe, although they were still confined to fashionable undress, or what we might call casual wear. Hoods were initially optional for mantelets, and their size grew and diminished through time based on the hairstyles and fashion. By the 1770s, Garçon writes that we always had a hood. And in another example, the Galerie de Mode notes in 1778 that when hairstyles rose, the hoods obliged to conform to the fashion, taking on an excessive size without being useful. They formed more of a type of cape on the mantelet rather than a hood.
So now that you know more about mantelets and have your pattern, let's discuss fabrics, lining, and if you want to adjust the shape of the mantelet at all. If you plan to make an unlined mantelet for warmer weather, you might consider using a plain lightweight cotton or linen, or an embroidered muslin, such as this, spotted muslin, plain silk gauze works well too, as does this lovely spotted gauze, and a silk lutestring. If you want to make it for a little bit cooler weather, you might consider lining one of these muslins or silk gauze with a lutestring, or using a heavier silk taffeta, a figured silk, or brocaded silk, and lining it as well. And for the coldest of weather, you can also use a velvet or perhaps even a broadcloth. For our mantelet, I'm using this lovely ivory corded silk taffeta and lining it with the salmon and white lutestring silk. And I'll be using our white sewing silk thread for the whole project. Now let's talk about the length and shape of your mantelet. Mantelets can range from being very short to the mid-back to mid-length around the upper thigh. If you'd like to adjust the length of yours, simply mark your new length on the pattern and cut it out on that line. You can also play around with the shape of your mantelet hem if you'd prefer more or less curve for the front portion. Now, since I'm making a lined silk mantelet, I'll be following the directions in our pattern for C. So I'll be cutting one outer and one lining of the body, the hood, the neckband. If you're doing a unlined mantelet or the broadcloth, you're going to want to follow the directions for A and B. It's very similar to what we're doing in the sew-along, and it requires even less sewing than what you're going to see today. All right, so let's go ahead and cut out the pattern and the fabric. When laying out the pattern, make sure that you check that you are following the grain line on the pattern. This will match up parallel with the selvage of the fabric, and make sure to use as little fabric as possible to match up with your pattern. So as you can see, I have 2 yards of fabric here, but I folded it so that I have extra hanging down at the bottom, since I've chosen to use the shortest length for my mantelet. And make sure that the center part of the mantelet is on the fold. And when you're laying out your hood, make sure you do the same thing, that the grain line is parallel to the selvage and that the top of the hood is on the fold. And remember, when you're cutting all of these out, we've already included a 1/4 inch seam allowance in all of the pattern. You'll also want to cut out one piece for the neckband, one outer and one inner from wherever works best on the fabric you have left. And when it comes to cutting out the ruffles for the trim on your mantelet, our pattern piece calls for 6 36 by 3 pieces. If your fabric is wider than that though, from selvage to selvage, you don't necessarily need to stick to the 6 pieces. Say if you have 45-inch wide fabric, you could do 5 lengths of 45 by 3. If, like I do, you have 54-inch wide fabric, you could do 4 lengths from selvage to selvage of 54 inches. All of that adds up to around 215 inches, which is perfectly adequate for trimming your mantelet. All right, so let's go ahead and lay this out and get cutting. All right, so now that we have everything cut out, let's go ahead and start putting our mantelet together. We are going to start with the body of the mantelet and begin by laying our lining on our outer fabric, wrong sides together. And you might want to put in a few pins, as I have, to hold the fabric in place. If you want to do large basting stitches to hold it together, you're totally welcome to do that. And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to hem the entire outer edge of the hem. We're going to start at the little mark here for where the neckline alignment is. And this is just around the curve here of the front of the mantelet. And we're going to turn the lining towards the outer fabric. Remember, it's about 1/4 of an inch, laying the lining fabric to it so that the lining is just slightly inside the edge of the outer fabric. And as I said, we're going to do this all the way around to the neck alignment mark on the other side. So you're not finishing the neckline. All right, so we're at the point of the front hem and where the curve comes in, and it's a little tricky in this area. So the easiest way to do this is to fold the outer fabric seam allowance in completely all the way down. To then take the lining edge fabric and open the seam allowance out on the side, but turn the amount that you want at the end under. Then you can turn up the outer that same amount that you turned the lining under. And then this little bit of seam allowance here can be folded around the outer fabric. And once you get that, put a pin in it really quickly so you don't lose it. And this is the same way you'd finish the top and bottom necklines on a gown. All right, so that goes nice and tidy. And then we can do the same thing on the corner here. And remember, this doesn't have to be perfect because you're going to put trim over top of it. So we're going to curve this part around. All right, so outer fabric is folded in. We find our fold for the bottom. We open up our lining. We lay the lining to the outer fabric, and then we fold the lining seam allowance in right there. And depending on how sharp or how curvy your point is right here, you may not have to fold in. It may just naturally curve around. But that works pretty good right there. So now that we have the lining fabric pinned to the exterior, we're ready to hem or fell the lining to the outer fabric from the inside. I'm going to use the hem stitch because that's my preference, but the fell stitch is perfectly fine as well. And on my fabric, I'm probably going to do about 6 to 8 stitches to an inch, because over top of all of this from the outside, I'll be adding trim, and that will add a whole nother layer of stitching that will help hold the lining fabric to the outer fabric. Now let's put together the hood. And we're pretty much going to start the same way we did with the body of the mantelet, by laying the lining on top of the outer fabric, and we'll be folding the seam allowances towards each other and hemming or felling both long edges together. We're not going to do anything to these short edges right now, because that's what's going to go into the neck of the mantelet. So let's go ahead and pin our lining to the outer fabric and fold our seam allowances in and get hemming. So you'll notice that I've changed the order of how we're putting this mantelet together a little bit from how it is in the pattern, so that we're doing all the long sewing first before we do the construction of assembling things together. So you've sewn the long edges on your mantelet body, on the hood, and now we're going to hem all of the trim before we start putting everything together next time. So to begin with, take your lengths of ruffle, whether you cut 6, 5, or 4, depending on the width of your fabric. So we've laid right sides together and pinned it, and now we're going to back stitch each section of ruffle to the next section. So now that we have one long strip of 216 or so inches, we're going to press our seams open. You can just use your fingers or a bone creaser or an iron. And now we are going to turn all of the seam allowance back on the edges twice. So you're going to fold it 1/4 of an inch and then fold it again. And you can baste this, you can pin this, you can press this, your favorite method, and then we are going to hem all 432 inches of this. All right, let's get going. Thank you so much for joining us for part 1 of our mantelet sew along. In part 2, we will be attaching the hood to the body of the mantelet and adding on all of the trim. If you've enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel. And if you have any questions or comments, please put them below. Until next time, happy sewing.